now. This is the India Development Debate. I'm Sandeep Gurumurthy joining you live from our news center in Mumbai. Joining me in Delhi is my colleague Supriya Srinath. We've got an action-packed dual edition of the India Development Debate. First up, the first debate. RBI Governor Urjit Patel is an angry man facing flak for the failure of the central bank to detect the PNB scam. Patel has finally hit back. In a speech delivered yesterday at a law university in Gandhinagar, Patel said it is not feasible for the RBI to be in every nook and corner of banking activity to detect fraud. Invoking Lord Shiva, Patel says he's ready to play Neelkant and consume all the poison if the government so wishes. The governor also took a dig at bank management, saying that they should play the role of Devas or the god rather than Asuras, the destroyers. Governor Patel's frank chat with law students in Gujarat has opened a new front in the blame game over India's biggest bank scam ever.
Indeed. Now remember, addressing the ET Global Business Summit just last week, Finance Minister Jaitley had taken a dig at the RBI, which should have had its third eye always open, according to him. Jaitley went on to say, in India, while politicians are accountable, regulators often go scot-free. Patel, however, blames the dual regulation by the Reserve Bank and the government for the deep fissures in the banking regulation. We at ET Now mostly agree with what Governor Patel has said, that there are structural deficiencies in effective regulation of the bank, but at the same time, the central bank cannot wish away its responsibility altogether for the big bank loot involving thousands of crores of taxpayers' money. Governor versus the government is the big topic of discussion right here on the India Development Debate tonight, and I've got a stellar panel of guests with the best perspective on this matter to take the story forward. Anand Sinha, former Deputy Governor of the RBI, joins us right here. We've got Pradeep Chaudhary, former Chairman SBI, joining us right here. And Hemendra Hazare, market expert, also joins us on the India Development Debate. Thanks each one of you for being with us. And Mr. Sinha, thank you very much for making an exception and making the television appearance. I will begin this discussion with you. The government says the PNB or the Nirav Modi scam was a regulatory failure on account of supervising authorities, essentially referring to the RBI. The RBI in turn says its hands were tied. Now, who is really going to take the blame for this 12,700 crore rupees scam after all, which involved taxpayers' money?
Well, I would agree with Dr. Patel on the basic premise that you cannot expect RBI to be able to regulate all nooks and corners of a bank. See, it is internationally accepted that the first line of defense is the bank itself. If everything fails in the bank, it may be too much to expect that RBI would be able to find out what is wrong in a bank. But having said that, it doesn't mean that RBI should not introspect, should look at where the failures were, of course in the system and also within the RBI, whether things could have been done better. And it invariably happens whenever anything of this kind happens, there is introspection and systems and procedures are tightened. But my basic point is this: scams happen, regulations and supervision is tightened in that area. For example, let us look at 1992 scam. It was a big securities scam. A lot of things were done. After that, it has not happened. But that is not the solution, final solution. The final solution lies in the fact that the bank management, the inspection, the audit, the concurrent audit, all these systems operate in a very solid way, so that even if scams do happen, even if things do go wrong, they are not prolonged, they are caught in time, and necessary punitive and corrective action is taken. So that is the essence of the point, because wherever there is a finance, things do go wrong once in a while. But the regularity and the most disturbing fact that for 7 years this was going on is something that should not happen at all.
Away from the responsibility of the regulator, is it fair to just pin the blame on the bank and the management of the bank? The government says, government puts its hands up saying that we don't look after day-to-day operations of banks. RBI says we have no means of detecting fraud. So can the RBI really wash its hands off it and just blame it all on the bank and the bank management?
No, I think I largely agree with Dr. Anand Sinha that it is the bank and the bank management which is at fault. But RBI's role is the second eye. So for example, install traffic lights, but somebody has to ensure that people are observing the traffic lights. Moment the motorists feel that nobody is observing the traffic lights, then there would be chaos. So therefore, RBI has to make its own intervention more meaningful. And even a mention was made of the 1992 scam. After 1992 scam, most significant thing that happened was that RBI computerized its SGL. So there would be collective responsibility, but I think RBI's oversight should be more, I am not saying every nook and corner, but at least on a priority basis, what is called an ABC analysis basis, on a priority basis, they must be more watchful. And it doesn't help to say that I don't have powers. Now, everybody has limited powers, but the question is, within that limited powers, how much of it has been effectively used?
That's a fair point indeed. You can't wash your hands off saying we have no power, and how much of that power is effectively being put to use will really determine this. But I still have a follow-up question, and Mr. Hemendra Hazare, this really comes your way. At the ETGBS, the finance minister just last week specifically said that the regulator needs to have a third eye. My question is, whose job is it to regulate PSBs then? Whose job is it to detect a fraud of this nature? The government as the largest shareholder and also the one that appoints the board, like the RBI says, or the RBI that is the regulator and does an audit every year? I mean, how can a scam of this magnitude goes undetected between the two parties involved? Whose job is it to really then regulate?
It is very apparent that from what we know today that the senior management appears to not to have noticed anything that was going on because it was being done by a lower level employee. Now my issue with the RBI is this: have you inspected this particular branch in the last 6 years? What did the inspecting officer of RBI do? Did he download the SWIFT messages? Was there any attempt made to check the Nostro accounts? Were they doing these very basic checks? Now RBI has to answer that. Was it that this particular branch was not audited, was not inspected by RBI at all? Which I would think is doubtful in the last 6 years. So what did the RBI inspection find out when they have inspected this branch? Because if they have inspected this branch, they have to answer to Parliament. Then what did they do with the SWIFT, the SWIFT system? Did they download it? Did they check the reconciliation was taking place with the Nostro accounts? Because if they had done that, then obviously the third eye would have spotted there's something obviously wrong here. So here it was a multiple level fraud, systems failure within PNB and also within the RBI. The RBI, Mr. Chaudhary rightly said, you cannot now claim that you don't have enough powers. Nobody has enough powers. Probably only God has those powers, but you can't create heaven on earth.
Dr. Patel made is that, we don't have the same powers over state-owned banks that we have over private banks. I'm trying to understand what are the powers that it has over the private banks that it could have potentially helped detect this fraud. I'm trying to understand the reference and the import of this statement made by Governor Urjit Patel.
He is the best person to answer your question, but let me try and interpret. Probably what he was talking about, not about the detection of the fraud per se, but about the attitude, about the fact that because of the fact that Reserve Bank doesn't have control on or powers regarding corporate governance, the attitude of the public sector banks is not the same as it is in the case of private sector banks. That is the point that he made. And the second point which he made was that market discipline doesn't work in the case of public sector banks. For example, if PNB was a private sector bank, today what would have happened? There would have been probably a run. They would have faced severe difficulties in the market. Now, of course, they are facing difficulties. I'm not saying that they don't face any difficulty.
See, so many banks have failed.
They don't face existential issues. So the issue
they
is,
don't face existential issues because whenever they are in trouble, they are merged with public sector banks. So that is how you avoid existential issues.
Mr. Chaudhary, allow me to interrupt. Let Dr. Sinha complete his point, and then we're coming to you for a reaction. Please go, Dr. Sinha.
Dr. Sinha complete his point. Go, Dr. Sinha.
So that, to my mind, that is the basic issue. For example, I can tell you that during the global financial crisis, for example, we saw that deposits were migrating from the private sector banks to the public sector banks. So government ownership, the government protection is a great thing. It has a lot of value, but as they say, there has to be a time and place for that. During stress times, there is no alternative to government ownership. The issue is during peace times or on a continuing basis, do we need a government ownership? I think these are the issues which have been raised.
Talking about the government ownership, and I know Mr. Prateep Chaudhary wants to make a point there, and Mr. Chaudhary, I'll come to you, and I'm coming to you, sir, but I also have a question. Governor Patel doesn't just stand up against accusations that are made against the RBI. He has in no uncertain terms chosen the present time to ask for the same power over governance at state banks as private ones, to preside properly as a regulator, is what he says. Isn't that a fair demand, given the political interference that one sees in functioning of PSU banks? How on earth can the RBI not have the same governing or supervisory powers over state-owned lenders that it does over private sector banks?
In fact, the boot is in the other leg. RBI puts its representatives on the board of public sector banks. Tell me a single private sector bank where RBI has put its representative. So I think we are digressing from the main topic to the ownership. I think ownership is an issue which can be decided. It's the prerogative of the government to decide. Whether government should have 51%, 1%, 99%. I think it is the government to decide, government of the day to decide, and I don't think we should be debating. What we are debating is that in the existing scheme of things, in the oversight, how effective has the regulator been? And I would suggest, I mean, not being, critical, but as a advice, I would suggest that as global regulators do in foreign countries, in fact, in Canada, the regulators admit that they don't understand each and every aspect of the banking as such. So they bring talent from outside, some retired officers of the bank, or in case of systems audit, why don't you get the companies who have developed the systems, and how many of them are there? TCS has developed Banks 24, Infosys is Finacle, and there is another company or another one or two companies. So I think RBI auditors need to be hands-on and need to be, very familiar and proficient in the systems. So that is something, we should not discount. We should not say, no, that is only a mechanical issue, that is only a clerical issue. We should discuss about bigger things. But the thing is that regulation and safety, it's a boring job, but it requires application, it requires understanding of the system, and please remember, the thieves are always one step ahead of the cops. So the cop, in order to get hold of the thief, has to be equally smart, if not smarter than the thief. So RBI should, attempt at that. And if RBI itself cannot do, why don't they train up their statutory auditors? They have a whole lot of chartered accountant firms at their disposal who go and inspect the banks. Why don't they develop them? At least for the large size banks, large size branches, large size operations, they could be thinking of doing it.
Fair point that you're making. Hemant Zazari, I want to comment on that. The broader import of the governor's message is we neither have ownership nor do we have control when it comes to PSU banks. It's the government that has ownership. It's the government that has control. They appoint the board. They appoint the nominees. They have say on on the operations of the bank. So effectively, we neither have ownership nor do we have control. And so, to that extent, our hands are tied. Do you buy that argument?
Actually not, because RBI has powers to remove directors, CEOs of private sector banks. What have they done with those powers? Look at the divergences that these new private sector banks have reported. Axis Bank, Yes Bank, 2 consistent consecutive years of huge divergences. This should have led to the firing of the CEO, the CFO, and the auditor. This is where the RBI should have stepped in. It had the powers. It did not do anything. It just put some paltry fine on them. Look at another instance today. There is massive mis-selling of life insurance going on in ICICI Bank in the state of Rajasthan in collusion with ICICI Prudential. RBI is well aware of it. Complaints they have been receiving from Rajasthan. What have they done? Nothing. So this whole idea that you give me powers and I will, fix the job. When you have these powers, you have not done anything. You have chosen not to have done anything. So what is then, what is the point of demanding more and more powers when you cannot effectively implement the powers that you have?
Okay, but Mr. Sinha, if I may come to you, the larger point that Mr. Hazari is making is that what is the point of asking for powers when you are not going to put it to effective use? But the counter argument to that could well be that this is a very lopsided field. You know, the RBI says we do not have the same powers that that we have over private sector banks. It's the government that can replace boards. We can't revoke licenses. We do not appoint the board. Is there at least room for thinking on legislative changes to be made? At least that's what the governor seems to be demanding at this stage. Make legislative changes. Do you believe this is going to force New Delhi to make the legislative changes that the RBI seems to be demanding at this stage? Because this isn't just another regulatory failure. This is a huge scam that has been unearthed, and there is blame game that lies on both sides.
I mean, certainly there has to be, there has been a long-standing debate about the reforms in public sector banks. And what Dr. Patel has talked about is a part of that. So these legislative changes on the grounds of level playing field, because as I explained earlier, it is a question of how people react to the powers that RBI has or doesn't have. I think that is the basic issue, and therefore, if we go into the larger issue of reforms in the banking sector, more specifically on public sector banks, this is certainly a building block for that.
The other comment made by Dr. Patel, almost telling the government the direction in which it needs to move when it comes to reforming, implying, I don't know whether he's implying privatization or not. I don't know. How have you read those comments in his speech? What do you make of that suggestion that the governor is making to the government on the direction in which it needs to move as far as banking reforms are concerned?
I think there is a meeting of RBI board possibly every quarter, if not more frequently. So these issues where the finance ministry officials and sometimes the finance minister himself is present, why doesn't RBI escalate these issues here rather than talking in public forums to which people may not pay enough attention? And secondly, that if RBI was so vigilant about private sector banks, how do you explain the fact that from 1965 onwards, at least 40 private sector banks had collapsed? And what did RBI do? They went and merged them with public sector banks. So what are you accepting? That the public sector bank is better managed than the private sector bank. And now I see the opposite argument that the private sector banks allow surveillance, public sector banks don't. Now if private sector banks gives you unfettered surveillance right, why did Nedungadi Bank fail? Why did Global Trust Bank fail? Why did United Western Bank fail? And so many of them, there you didn't have any restriction on your regulatory or supervisory powers.
All right, that's actually a very contrarian argument to this whole privatization debate and narrative that's doing the round, and we appreciate all kinds of contrarian arguments. But Heminder Hazari, do you agree with this? Has Dr. Patel stopped short of talking and asking for privatization of and reduction in role for state-owned lenders? I mean, I'm just going to quote, he talks and cites about better use of public resources. You know, Mr. Chaudhary is giving one side of the argument that don't eulogize the private sector banks. They failed as well. Privatization may not be the answer to all the ills that plague India's banking system. But is the governor stopping short of advocating greater privatization?
I think he's very brazen about it. He has joined the bandwagon of Arvind Subramaniam and a lot of commentators in the media to privatize the government banks. It is very clear that this is the agenda of some very important people in government today, that they are using a crisis really to push forth this agenda. And in my view, this agenda does not have much substance, and the banking in India, especially when we are a very low income per capita country, the bulk of banking assets must be state owned and state managed. This idea of getting private sector to, have a very important role in banking, the private sector banks, even if you see the study of the new private sector banks, they just focus on profitable areas. They just look at creamy layers of operations. They focus their business in metropolitan India. They will totally ignore rural India. They will ignore financial inclusion. And you cannot have this in a country like India, where vast sections of your population are very low income. And this whole idea, when he talks about, level playing field, one thing you will note there's an absence of in his speech is that if you really want a level playing field, then have the CBI, the CVC, the CIC, all of them also let them come and start inspecting the new private sector banks and the private sector banks. That he's totally ignored. Because once you start doing that, you will find the amount of scams, frauds will all start coming out from some of these new private sector banks. Then we'll truly have a level playing field. But naturally, he doesn't talk about this at all.
Comments on this privatization debate. Do you interpret the governor's statements as making a veiled attempt, indication that the government should look at privatization, maybe reduce its ownership in state-owned entities? And there is a case for it. I know Hemendra and Pradeep Chaudhary made a strong case for why it shouldn't be considered. But there are enough and more people on the other side of the fence who believe there's a case for industry has been clamoring for reducing at least ownership of the government. Back in the 90s, Yashwant Sinha had recommended that government should not own more than 33% stake in state-owned banks. Do you believe there's a case, and is this the time?
As far as Dr. Patel's speech is concerned, I would say that certainly he has indicated towards privatization without saying it in so many words. Now, privatization is or the question of privatizing public sector banks is a very complex issue. I entirely agree with Hemendra that, or with Mr. Pradeep Chaudhary, that India has developmental needs, and these developmental needs can be met through the public sector system and not so much through the private sector system. While I agree with that, I wouldn't take a view, a binary view, that there should be privatization or there should not be privatization. I would take a view, my personal view if you ask me, that privatization is something which is desirable. Now, let me give one example. You see, capital requirements are necessary but not sufficient requirement for a bank to function well. Now, when it comes to capital itself, the best practices which have developed in the world is that there are very intense stress tests done over a horizon of 2 to 3 years, and that determines how much capital banks should have. Now, do we do it in India? Obviously not, because we are short of capital, and that is on account of government ownership. So that, to my mind, itself is good reason for privatization, apart from several other reasons. Now, but at the same time, I do acknowledge that developmental needs are very substantial in our country. So we have to treat privatization as a process and not as a switch which you put on or put off. There could be several models. One model could be that you choose 4 or 5 public sector banks who cover the entire country, and they concentrate on financial inclusion kind of thing. Let me say that they operate more like small banks, small finance banks, rather than like corporate banks. So that is one method. The second thing is that you can develop alternate structures. For example, we have small finance banks, we have NBFCs, MFIs. So I think, to my mind, over a period of time, we have to take care of both. And that is the view which I hold.
And we respect that view, that it has to be perhaps a nuanced approach and not a blanket approach to privatization at all. But if I may come to you, Mr. Chaudhary, and very short in time, I would like you to react to our last question. Is Urjit Patel finally rising to the occasion and defending the institution that's under attack? Or is it the scare of a scam taint that is making the rather reticent RBI governor speak up?
I am too small a person to comment on the intentions or the mind of the RBI governor, and I would not like to do that. But I just like to mention a point that when I was in service, I had the opportunity to meet 2 finance ministers, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee and before that Mr. Chidambaram. And I asked them the same question, that the private sector banks, some of them have a much better market perception in the stock market. So would you like SBI to become a look-alike of HDFC Bank or ICICI Bank or something like that? And both of them were very categorical in their reply. They said never. And they said that private sector banks have been created for this small purpose, what they call mercantile purpose of maximizing return on equity, whereas public sector banks have a much greater purpose of serving the large society. Now, I don't know if the thinking of the government has changed, So it will be for the government because they are the owners. So they have to decide whether they will keep 51%, 40%, and these things, you know, RBI can bounce with the government when they have regular meetings of the RBI board rather than, you know, throwing it in public domain.
Okay, 30 seconds, that's a fair point. 30 seconds, Hemendra Hazari. Is Urjit Patel standing up for institution? He's been under attack for not speaking up, for having kept quiet for so long, but is he finally breaking his silence? Is he now fighting for the institutional credibility of RBI?
His governorship, RBI's credibility, I think, has fallen to its nadir, especially since the disaster of demonetization that they inflicted on the entire economy. And here also you see, just like in demonetization, you have this scam going on. Ministry of Finance people are talking. Here the regulator chooses to remain silent. And then when he finally speaks, he blames everybody else but you know, the regulator. So this is the thing. Now he's doing it out of, I think, sheer desperation. But sadly, I think when RBI's history is written, I don't think Urjit Patel's conduct will be looked upon very favorably.
All right, that's not such a charitable description, but on that note, I think completely out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. I can't thank enough our stellar panel, Mr. Anand Sinha, Mr. Pradeep Chaudhary and Mr. Hemendra Hazari for joining us. The RBI Governor has finally broken his silence on the big need of Modi's scam, but is it too little and perhaps too late is the big question, and will the government at least review and rethink some of the legislative changes that he's wanting and demanding and asking for to supervise public sector banks?